Every single one of your ancestors, going back hundreds of thousands of years, managed to keep at least one child alive long enough to reproduce. Think about that. No antibiotics, no car seats, no baby monitors, no parenting books telling them they were doing everything wrong. Just vibes, animal instincts, and an absolutely terrifying amount of luck. And somehow, against all statistical probability, here you are. Watching this video, breathing air, existing. So how did they do it? How did ancient humans keep kids alive when the infant mortality rate was somewhere between horrifying and mathematically improbable? Buckle up, because we're about to take a darkly comedic journey through history's most chaotic childcare practices. And spoiler alert, it's going to make you feel really, really grateful for modern medicine. Let's start at the very beginning. Being born in the ancient world was essentially like winning a lottery, where most of the tickets were just different flavors of death. Historians estimate that in prehistoric times, somewhere between 30 and 50% of children died before reaching age 5. 50%. Half. That's a coin flip between growing up to hunt mammoths or becoming a cautionary tale your tribe tells around the campfire. And the dangers started immediately. The moment of birth itself was incredibly risky for both mother and baby. There were no sterile environments, no fetal heart monitors, no emergency cesarean sections if something went wrong. Your survival depended entirely on whether your mother's body cooperated, whether you came out facing the right direction, and whether the person catching you had clean hands. Which, let's be honest, they probably did not. Ancient parents didn't have the luxury of worrying about screen time or organic baby food. Their parenting concerns were more along the lines of, "Please don't get eaten by wolves, and I hope this winter isn't the one that kills us all." It was survival mode, all the time, for everyone. And somehow, humanity persisted. Now let's talk about the actual moment of arrival. Ancient births happened in some truly memorable locations. Tents, caves, muddy huts that made modern hospital rooms look like luxury spas. The medical equipment available consisted of whatever sharp object was nearby for cutting the umbilical cord, and maybe some animal skins to keep everyone warm. The attending physician was typically a midwife whose professional qualifications could be summarized as "she's done this before," and most of those babies lived. In ancient Egypt, women gave birth squatting on special bricks because apparently the floor was too mainstream. In ancient Greece, they had dedicated birthing chairs, which honestly sounds more civilized until you remember there was no anesthesia and the cure for complications was usually prayer. Roman midwives were actually pretty skilled and had real training, which is nice, but they also thought the position of the stars during birth determined the baby's entire future. So, mixed bag. The strategies for surviving childbirth were creative, to say the least. Some cultures used herbal medicines that actually worked. Raspberry leaf tea, for example, has been used for thousands of years to help with labor, and modern science confirms it can actually be helpful. Other cultures relied on spiritual rituals, calling on goddesses of childbirth to protect mother and baby. And some cultures did things we cannot explain or defend, like the ancient Babylonian practice of placing a dead mouse near the laboring woman to absorb evil spirits. Did it work? Statistically, sometimes. Was it the mouse? Almost certainly not. But here's the thing. Despite the chaos, despite the complete absence of anything we'd recognize as medical care, women kept having babies, and enough of those babies survived to continue the species. The human body is remarkably good at this whole reproduction thing when it works. And ancient humans learned, through generations of trial and error, what actually helped and what was just wishful thinking with extra steps. Once the baby arrived, the next immediate crisis was feeding them. And in a world without formula, refrigeration, or any understanding of food safety, this was a genuine emergency if the mother couldn't nurse. Enter the wet nurse. The concept seems strange to us now, but for most of human history, having another woman breastfeed your baby was completely normal and incredibly common. In ancient Mesopotamia, wet nursing was a legitimate profession with actual contracts. We have clay tablets from 4,000 years ago that specify how much a wet nurse should be paid, what she could and couldn't eat while nursing, and penalties if the baby died on her watch. Ancient human resources, basically. In Egypt, wet nurses held positions of honor in royal households. The woman who nursed a future pharaoh could expect serious social benefits for her entire family. In Rome, wealthy families often had multiple wet nurses on staff, rotating shifts like some kind of ancient lactation factory. But why was wet nursing so common? Part of it was practical. If a mother died in childbirth, which happened frequently, someone else had to feed that baby or it would die. Part of it was social. In many cultures, wealthy women were expected to get pregnant again as quickly as possible to produce more heirs, and breastfeeding naturally delays fertility. So they outsourced the nursing to servants or slaves, which is deeply uncomfortable to think about but was completely normalized. And part of it was just community survival. In smaller tribal groups, nursing was often shared among all the mothers. If your milk came in strong and your neighbors didn't, you fed both babies. No awkwardness. No weird stigma. Just practical problem solving to keep tiny humans alive. The really creative solutions came when no human milk was available at all. Ancient peoples experimented with animal milk from goats, sheep, donkeys, even camels, depending on geography. The problem was that animal milk isn't quite right for human babies, and without any way to sterilize it, it often carried dangerous bacteria. Some cultures invented primitive feeding vessels, ceramic containers with spouts that functioned like ancient bottles. Archaeologists have found these in baby graves dating back thousands of years, still containing residue of animal milk. It's genuinely heartbreaking. These were parents desperately trying to keep their children alive with whatever tools they could invent. Sometimes it worked. Often it didn't. But they kept trying. Speaking of inventions, let's talk about ancient baby gear, because our ancestors came up with some absolutely unhinged solutions for the eternal problem of, how do I do anything with this helpless creature attached to me? Swaddling is probably the most universal. Virtually every ancient culture wrapped babies tightly in cloth, essentially creating tiny human burritos. The Greeks did it. The Romans did it. Native American tribes did it. Ancient Chinese families did it. Everyone, everywhere, independently decided that babies needed to be immobilized for their own good. And they weren't gentle about it either. In medieval Europe, babies were swaddled so tightly for so long that their muscles sometimes atrophied. The thinking was that loose limbs would grow crooked, which, ironic, because the extreme swaddling probably caused more problems than it prevented. But here's the thing. Modern research actually supports gentle swaddling for newborns. It mimics the pressure of the womb and helps them sleep. Our ancestors were onto something. They just took it about 12 steps too far. Then there were cradle boards, used by many indigenous cultures in the Americas. These were basically wooden boards with straps that held babies securely against a parent's back. Sounds restrictive, right? But these things were actually genius. Babies could see the world from an upright position, stayed close to their caregivers for warmth and bonding, and were protected from environmental dangers. Plus, parents had their hands free to gather food, build shelters, or fight off predators. Ancient baby wearing at its finest. The Romans invented something called a lunula, a crescent moon-shaped amulet that babies wore to protect them from evil spirits. Which seems superstitious until you remember that we put babies in rooms decorated with stars and moons, and play them lullabies about things falling from trees. Maybe we're not so different. My personal favorite piece of ancient baby gear is the terracotta feeding bottle shaped like an animal. These weren't just functional, they were cute. Little pig-shaped vessels with spouts for milk. 4,000 years ago, some parent thought, you know what would make this feeding situation better? If the bottle looked like a little piggy. And honestly, that energy hasn't changed. Have you seen modern baby bottles? They come in every shape and color imaginable. Ancient parents and modern parents, united across millennia by the shared desire to make baby gear slightly more whimsical than strictly necessary. Once children could walk, ancient parents faced a new challenge. Toddlers are essentially tiny drunk people with no sense of self-preservation and a mysterious attraction to anything that could kill them. Fire? Fascinating. Rivers? Must touch. Sharp objects? delicious. And in the ancient world, dangerous things weren't baby-proofed behind plastic safety locks. They were just there, all the time, everywhere. So how did ancient kids survive toddlerhood? 2 words: village parenting. In most ancient societies, children weren't raised exclusively by their biological parents. They were raised by everyone: aunts, uncles, grandparents, older siblings, neighbors, random community members who happened to be nearby when a toddler wandered toward the cooking fire. This is what anthropologists call alloparenting, and it's probably how humans evolved to raise children in the first place. Our big brains and helpless babies require more caregiving than 1 or 2 people can reasonably provide. So we outsourced. In many hunter-gatherer societies that anthropologists have studied, children moved freely between households, eating at whichever home had food, sleeping wherever they got tired, constantly supervised by dozens of adults who all felt responsible for their survival. It takes a village wasn't just a saying. It was literally how humans kept their offspring alive for hundreds of thousands of years. Children also started contributing to the community surprisingly young by modern standards. 3-year-olds could fetch water, sort berries, chase birds away from crops. 5-year-olds watched even younger children, essentially serving as ancient babysitters. 7-year-olds worked alongside adults in fields or helped with hunting preparations. This seems harsh to us, but it served a survival purpose. Busy children are supervised children. Children learning real skills are children who know how to function in their environment. And children who feel useful are children who are integrated into the community that will keep them alive. Compare that to modern kids, who we bubble wrap until age 18 and then release into the world to discover they don't know how to do their own laundry. Maybe there's a middle ground here. When ancient children got sick, and they got sick a lot, the medical treatments available were a fascinating mix of genuine wisdom, complete nonsense, and remedies that might actually kill you faster than the disease. Let's start with what actually worked. Ancient peoples discovered a remarkable number of effective herbal medicines through trial and error. Willow bark, which contains the active ingredient in aspirin. Honey, which has real antibacterial properties. Chamomile for stomach problems. Garlic as an antimicrobial. These weren't lucky guesses. They were the accumulated wisdom of generations who paid attention to what helped and passed that knowledge down. But then there was the other stuff. In ancient Egypt, a common remedy for children's illnesses involved mixing a dead mouse with other ingredients and feeding it to the sick child. The dead mouse thing was really popular in ancient medicine, and I cannot overstate how much it did not help. Ancient Greek physicians might prescribe bleeding a sick child to balance their humors, which is a great way to make a weak child even weaker. Roman children with fevers might be given amulets inscribed with magic words, which at least had the benefit of not actively harming them. Medieval European remedies for childhood illnesses included things like tying a live frog to the child's throat for croup, or hanging wolf teeth around their neck to help with teething. The wolf teeth thing was so popular that we found them in archaeological sites across multiple cultures and centuries. Everybody loved wolf teeth. Did they work? No. But they made parents feel like they were doing something, which maybe helped with the psychological burden of watching your child suffer without any real power to help. The most heartbreaking ancient medical texts are the ones that show genuine attempts to understand childhood diseases. Ancient Babylonian tablets describe symptoms of what was probably measles or smallpox, with detailed instructions for treatment that had no chance of working. Ancient Chinese medical texts tried to categorize childhood illnesses and develop systematic treatments. These were smart, caring people doing their best with absolutely no understanding of germs, viruses, or how disease actually spreads. And somehow, despite the dead mice and the wolf teeth and the completely wrong theories about medicine, enough children survived. Not because the treatments worked, but because the human immune system is remarkably powerful, and ancient kids who survived their first few years developed immunity to local diseases that would devastate populations who hadn't been exposed. Given how dangerous childhood was, it's no surprise that ancient peoples called in some divine backup. Almost every civilization developed gods, goddesses, spirits, or rituals specifically focused on protecting children. Because apparently even the divine beings understood that human parents needed help with this impossible job. In ancient Greece, Artemis was the goddess of childbirth, despite being a virgin goddess who theoretically knew nothing about the subject. She was also the protector of young children and could both bring death to mothers in childbirth and save them from it. Mixed messaging? But okay. The Romans had Rumina, goddess of breastfeeding. Cuba, goddess of sleeping children. Cunina, goddess of cradles. They really specialized their divine labor. If your Roman baby wasn't sleeping well, you knew exactly which goddess to blame. The Egyptians had Bes, a dwarf god with a lion's mane and a weird tongue-sticking-out expression who protected households, mothers, and children. His image was carved on beds, headrests, and household items to keep evil spirits away from sleeping babies. He looked terrifying, but in a protective way, like a divine guard dog with very questionable fashion choices. In Mesopotamia, there were elaborate rituals to protect newborns from Lamashtu, a demon who was believed to cause miscarriage, stillbirth, and infant death. Parents would put protective amulets on babies and place images of the demon-fighting god Pazuzu in their homes. Yes, Pazuzu, the demon from The Exorcist, was originally a protective figure. Context is everything. These divine protection systems served real psychological purposes. When your child is sick and you have no effective medicine, no understanding of why this is happening, and no power to stop it, having a ritual to perform gives you something to do. Praying to a goddess of healing, making offerings at a temple, placing protective amulets on your child. These actions didn't cure diseases, but they gave terrified parents a sense of agency in impossible situations. And the rituals that surrounded child protection often had practical benefits hidden inside them. Blessing rituals might include washing the baby, which actually did help prevent infection. Protective practices might involve keeping strangers away from newborns, which limited disease exposure. Temple visits ensured that midwives and healers who had seen many children could check on the baby's health. The gods worked in mysterious ways, many of which were just good hygiene wrapped in supernatural packaging. Before schools existed, children had to learn everything necessary for survival through direct experience. And by direct experience, I mean following adults around, desperately trying not to get hurt, and absorbing skills through what I can only describe as aggressive osmosis. There was no curriculum, no age-appropriate introduction to hunting, no safety briefing before your first encounter with sharp tools. Just a 4-year-old watching adults butcher an animal and thinking, I could probably do that. Hunter-gatherer children learned through what anthropologists call play hunting. Adults made them small versions of real tools, like tiny bows and arrows that actually worked, and let them practice on small animals and insects. By the time they were 10, many children could contribute meaningfully to hunting parties. In agricultural societies, children learned farming by farming. They planted seeds, pulled weeds, harvested crops, tended animals. Often they were given the jobs that required small hands and flexible bodies, like reaching into tight spaces or squeezing through narrow gaps. Child labor? Absolutely. But in a survival context, everyone worked, and children learned by working alongside adults who could teach them in real time. Crafts were passed down through direct apprenticeship. A potter's child learned pottery by sitting next to their parent, making increasingly less terrible pots until they were good enough to sell. A blacksmith's child learned metalwork by pumping bellows, then watching, then assisting, then finally being trusted with actual hot metal. The learning process was dangerous, slow, and completely hands-on, but it produced genuinely skilled adults who knew their trade intimately because they'd been practicing since they could walk. There's something beautiful and terrifying about this approach. Beautiful because children were integrated into their communities as real contributors, learning skills that gave them purpose and competence. Terrifying because the learning curve included significant risk of injury or death, and there was no such thing as a safe learning environment. Modern education protects children from danger while teaching them. Ancient education was the danger, and the teaching, and the test, all happening simultaneously. The children who survived ancient childhood were a different breed entirely. By modern standards, they were tiny, battle-hardened veterans who had seen things no child today would ever encounter. A 5-year-old who had survived infancy, learned to walk while surrounded by real dangers, recovered from multiple illnesses without any effective medicine, and started contributing to their family's survival was not the same creature as a modern 5-year-old worrying about which cartoon to watch. These kids had immune systems forged in absolute chaos. Exposed to countless pathogens from birth, the survivors had built up natural immunity to diseases that would devastate unexposed populations. When Europeans arrived in the Americas and brought their diseases with them, the devastation among indigenous peoples was partly because they hadn't been exposed to those specific pathogens during childhood. Ancient survivors carried their immunity like armor. They were also psychologically different in ways we find uncomfortable. Death was not hidden from ancient children. They saw siblings die. They attended funerals. They watched animals slaughtered for food. This wasn't trauma in the modern sense. It was just life. Everyone knew death intimately because death was everywhere. And while we shouldn't romanticize this exposure, there's evidence that being familiar with death and hardship from a young age created resilient adults who could handle adversity. The ancient children who survived to adulthood had passed a brutal filter. They were the lucky ones, the strong ones, the ones whose particular combination of genetics and circumstances and community support got them through. And they passed that toughness, both genetic and cultural, to their own children. Every generation that survived made the next generation slightly better equipped to survive. That's you. You're descended from an unbroken chain of survivors going back millions of years. Every single one of your ancestors made it to reproductive age against incredible odds. That's your heritage. That's your lineage. You come from survivors. So after all the chaos, the dangerous cures, the questionable swaddling, and the terrifying statistics, what did ancient parents actually get right? Turns out, quite a lot. Skin-to-skin contact immediately after birth, which modern hospitals now promote as best practice? Ancient peoples did this automatically. Babies were placed directly on their mothers and kept there for warmth, bonding, and easy breastfeeding. Breastfeeding on demand rather than on a schedule? That's how humans evolved to feed babies, and ancient mothers did it instinctively before modern experts tried to impose artificial feeding times. Responsive parenting? Where you pick up a crying baby instead of letting them cry it out? That was the default for most of human history, and modern research confirms it leads to more secure attachment. Baby wearing, carrying infants close to your body throughout the day? Essential for ancient parents who needed their hands free, and now recognized as beneficial for infant development and parent-child bonding. Community-based child rearing, where multiple adults share responsibility for children? We've already talked about how universal this was, and modern research on child development suggests it's actually the optimal setup for raising healthy humans. Extended breastfeeding, often until age 3 or 4, that was normal throughout most of human history, and provides significant nutritional and immunological benefits. The things ancient parents got wrong, the dead mice and the wolf teeth, were their attempts to solve problems they didn't understand. The things they got right, the holding and the feeding and the community and the love, were instincts refined over millions of years of evolution. We modern parents have access to incredible tools our ancestors couldn't have imagined. Vaccines that prevent diseases that killed millions of children. Antibiotics that cure infections that were once death sentences. Medical knowledge that can save premature babies who would have had no chance just a century ago. We should use these tools. They're miracles. But we've also lost some things. The automatic community support. The integration of children into meaningful work. The acceptance of childhood as a time of learning through doing rather than preparing for some future life. Maybe the ideal approach combines ancient wisdom with modern medicine. Keep your babies close. Let them learn by doing. Build communities that share the burden of childcare. And also, vaccinate them and take them to actual doctors when they're sick. Our ancestors did their best with what they had. They kept enough children alive to continue the species against incredible odds. They developed practices and instincts that we're only now rediscovering through scientific research. And they loved their children fiercely, desperately, with everything they had. That hasn't changed. That will never change. From the first human parent cradling a newborn in a prehistoric cave to you watching this video, the love is the same. The tools have improved. The survival rates have improved. The swaddling techniques have definitely improved. But at the core, we're all just doing what humans have always done. Trying to keep these small, helpless, infinitely precious creatures alive long enough for them to become adults who can make their own terrible decisions. And somehow, improbably, beautifully, it keeps working. If you made it to the end of this video, congratulations. You are a survivor of at least 20 minutes of fairly dark historical content. If you learned something, or laughed at something, or just found yourself grateful that you weren't born in ancient Mesopotamia with a dead mouse prescription, please hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more videos exploring the weird, wonderful, and occasionally horrifying ways humans have navigated the challenges of existence throughout history. And leave a comment telling me what parenting practice your ancient ancestors would be most horrified by in the modern world. I'm betting it's something like, you let them look at a glowing rectangle for how many hours? Thanks for watching. Go hug a kid if you have one nearby. They're basically miracles, every single one of them.